Could a single day missing from a calendar permanently strip a convicted murderer of their right to an appeal? In the Mackenzie Shirilla case, it did. While millions are online debating her guilt, her defense team quietly suffered a catastrophic failure. They missed her ultimate filing deadline by exactly 24 hours. Their excuse? They completely forgot that 2024 was a leap year. But in a justice system governed by absolute statutory deadlines, does the court care about an honest clerical mistake, or is her case legally dead on arrival? Let's break down the cold, hard math. If you want the real facts behind the headlines, subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. Hit that button and let's uncover the truth together. You know, when we watch these high-profile trials on television, we often get a very warped sense of how the justice system actually works. The gavel falls, the judge reads the sentence, and we assume that the lawyers can just keep fighting forever. We assume that if they find something new, they can just walk right back into the courthouse and demand another hearing. But I need you to understand that the reality of the legal world is entirely different. It is cold, it is calculated, and it is built on absolute rigid boundaries. And in the case of Mackenzie Shirilla, those rigid boundaries just slammed the door completely shut on her defense. Before we get deep into the calendar dates and the math, we have to center ourselves on why these rules even exist in the first place. On August 21st, 2023, following a bench trial, Mackenzie Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. We can never lose sight of the human cost here. Two young men, Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, lost their lives in a horrific 100 miles per hour crash. According to police and prosecutors, that crash into a brick building was not an accident. It was an intentional act. The families of Dominic and Davion had to sit through a grueling trial, listening to the absolute worst moments of their lives analyzed piece by piece on the public record. When that sentence was handed down, it was supposed to offer some measure of finality. And that is exactly why the appellate system has such incredibly strict deadlines. The courts recognize that victims, families, cannot be dragged through endless open-ended litigation for decades. There has to be a finish line. So let's talk about what happens after a conviction. In Ohio, a criminal defendant basically has two main avenues to challenge a verdict. The first is what we call a direct appeal. That one is pretty straightforward. The defense lawyers look at the original trial, they look at what the judge said, what evidence was allowed, and they argue that a legal mistake was made on the public record. But the second avenue is much more complex, and that is the one that got completely derailed in this case. It is called a petition for post-conviction relief. Wow, this is the big one. A petition for post-conviction relief is the legal vehicle that allows a defendant to bring in brand new outside evidence that was never introduced during the original trial. If a defense team claims they have new medical documents or new expert testimony that wasn't heard before, this is the only way they can get it in front of a judge. But because this process basically asks the court to reopen a settled case, the rules governing it are incredibly unforgiving. The exact rules for this specific petition are found in the Ohio Revised Code, specifically section 2953.21a2. Now, if you are not a lawyer, reading statutory code can feel like reading a foreign language, but the mechanics of this are actually very simple once you break them down. The statute dictates exactly when the countdown clock starts for the defense team. And here's the thing that trips up a lot of people. The clock does not start on the day the defendant is sentenced. It does not start on the day they are loaded onto a bus and transferred to a state prison. According to court transcripts and the official appellate docket, the statutory timer officially starts on the exact day the original trial transcripts are formally filed with the Court of Appeals. That is the trigger. The clerk of courts physically stamps those documents, they are entered into the system, and at that very second, the hourglass gets flipped over. In the Shirilla case, those crucial trial transcripts were filed on October 23rd, 2023, right? October 23rd, 2023. That single date established the absolute unbreakable baseline for her legal team to assemble their arguments. From that moment, they knew the clock was ticking. You have to imagine what it is like sitting in that defense attorney's office. You have a massive mountain of work ahead of you. You were trying to overturn a murder conviction that, according to the prosecution, was supported by hard vehicle telemetry data showing the accelerator pedal was pushed to the floor. The defense knew they had to gather everything, perfectly format it, and submit it before time ran out. And this brings us to the fatal miscalculation. It happened precisely 1 year later. Shirilla's original appellate attorneys prepared her petition, finalized the paperwork, and submitted it to the court clerk on October 24th, 2024. Now, I want you to look at those dates. The trigger date was October 23rd, 2023. The filing date was October 24th, 2024. On the surface, to you and me, filing on October 24th for a case that started on October 23rd just looks like they missed a standard anniversary deadline by a single standard day. It is an incredibly human mistake to make. The defense team clearly operated on the assumption of a 1 calendar year timeline. They looked at the month of October, they saw the 23rd, and they targeted that exact same week the following year. If you have a subscription that renews on the 23rd, you expect it to renew on the 23rd of the next year. You don't sit down and count the individual days. But the legal system is not a subscription service, and the Ohio legislature did not write the words 1 calendar year into the law. They did not say, file this by the next anniversary. The text of the Ohio Revised Code explicitly states that a petition for post-conviction relief must be filed within exactly 365 days from the transcript filing date. 365 days. That specific numerical distinction is critical. It is the absolute core of why this entire appeal fell apart. Why? Because 2024 was a leap year. I see people online asking how lawyers could miss something like this, but when you are buried in thousands of pages of medical and legal documents, calendar math can slip right past you. Because 2024 was a leap year, the month of February contained 29 days instead of the standard 28. This meant that the calendar year stretching from October 2023 to October 2024 did not have 365 days. It contained 366 days. By relying on a standard calendar anniversary, instead of sitting down with a calendar and manually counting out 365 consecutive days, the defense team submitted the paperwork on day 366. Because of that one intervening leap day hidden back in February, the strict 365-day statutory limit had already expired. It expired exactly 24 hours before the defense attorneys walked into the clerk's office and had that petition date stamped. Just think about the gravity of that moment for everyone involved. Think about the families of Dominic and Davion, who are forced to monitor every single legal maneuver, for knowing that their nightmare could be dragged out for years if the defense finds a loophole. And then think about the defense team, realizing that their massive legal effort, their attempt to introduce new arguments about their client's medical history, was just completely derailed by a math error. You might be thinking, surely the court can just let one day slide, right? If the paperwork was ready, what difference does 24 hours really make? But in the eyes of the law, 24 hours is the difference between having legal rights and having absolutely none. When a deadline is written into the statute like that, it creates what is called a jurisdictional boundary. If you file on day 366, the judge does not have the legal authority to even open the envelope. They cannot look at the first page, they cannot read the arguments, and they cannot consider the new evidence. The court's hands are legally tied by the calendar. The prosecution saw that date stamp of October 24th, 2024, and they immediately moved to shut the whole thing down. They argued that the law must be applied uniformly. If the court ignores the leap year for one defendant, where does it end? Do they ignore 2 days for the next guy? A week? The state argued that the 365-day rule is absolute, precisely to protect the integrity of the convictions and to protect the victims' families from endless uncertainty. So the clerk's stamp hits the paper on October 24th, 2024. Day 366. And just like that, an entire avenue of post-conviction relief for a defendant serving a life sentence was officially time-barred. A leap year mistake didn't just cause a delay, it completely severed the court's jurisdiction to even hear what the defense had to say. When the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office got their hands on that post-conviction petition, you can imagine exactly what the room looked like. A lawyer or a clerk looks at the date stamp, October 24th, 2024. Then they pull the file and look at the original transcript filing date, October 23rd, 2023. At first glance, maybe it doesn't immediately set off alarm bells for an average person. It just looks like an anniversary date. But these prosecutors know the statutes inside and out. They are trained to look for procedural flaws before they even look at the arguments. They know exactly how many days are in a year. And more importantly, they know that 2024 had a February 29th, right? Once they did the math and realized it was actually day 366, they didn't hesitate for a second. They immediately filed a motion to have the entire petition thrown out. Now, before we get deep into the heavy legal arguments and the courtroom drama, I want us to take a step back and think about the human side of this. We cannot lose sight of why these rules exist. Think about the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. For them, the original trial in 2023 was supposed to be the end of a waking nightmare. They had to sit in that courtroom every single day. They had to listen to the vehicle telemetry data. They had to hear the police testify about how the car was pushed to 100 miles per hour and how the steering wheel was held straight into a brick building. They had to endure the absolute worst pain imaginable, all on the public record. When Mackenzie Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life, the families of Dominic and Davion probably thought they could finally start to heal. They probably thought they could close that chapter and just grieve in peace. But the reality of the legal system is that appeals rip that wound wide open again. Every time a new petition is filed, it drags the victims' families back into the courtroom, back into the news cycle, and back into the trauma. They have to worry all over again that the person convicted of killing their sons might find a loophole to walk free. The legal system knows this. The courts recognize the immense psychological toll that endless litigation takes on victims' families. That is exactly why these rigid, unforgiving deadlines exist. They are meant to balance a defendant's right to a fair appeal with a victim's family's right to finality. So when the prosecution filed their motion to dismiss over a missed deadline, they weren't just arguing over a math equation. They were actively defending that finality. They were saying enough is enough. On March 12, 2026, the Ohio 8th District Court of Appeals issued their decision. It was a unanimous, unbending ruling. Writing for the three-judge panel, Judge Anita Laster Mays affirmed the lower court's decision. She confirmed that the trial court possessed zero legal authority to even review the contents of that late filing. Wow. I really want you to let that sink in. Zero legal authority. This entire ruling hinges on a foundational concept in appellate law known as subject matter jurisdiction. If you are not a lawyer, subject matter jurisdiction sounds incredibly complicated, but I can explain it to you simply. It basically means the court's legal power to hear a case. Jurisdictional deadlines are absolute. They are not guidelines. They are not friendly suggestions from the judge. They are the concrete walls of the court's authority. Think of it like missing a commercial flight. If the gate closes at 8 a.m. and you run up at 8:01 a.m., it does not matter if you have the most compelling excuse in the world. It doesn't matter if your car broke down or if you had a medical emergency or if you just read the ticket wrong. The door is closed, the plane is pulling away, and the gate agent literally cannot let you on the plane. The system is locked. That is exactly how subject matter jurisdiction works. If a defense team files a document late, even by a single minute, let alone 24 hours, the court is instantly stripped of its jurisdictional power to read the arguments inside. The court becomes legally blind to the petition. I see people commenting online all the time about this. They say things like, why couldn't the judge just take a quick peek at the evidence? Or, if she really has proof of a medical blackout, shouldn't the court just look at it for the sake of justice? But that is just not how the law functions. If a judge were to read a time-barred petition and rule on it, their ruling would be legally void. The appellate court would just strike it down anyway because the judge did not have the power to make the ruling in the first place. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases, hit that button right now so we can keep uncovering the truth behind these complicated legal cases. During the appellate review, leading up to that March 2026 decision, the defense team realized they were backed into a dangerous corner. They knew they messed up the math, and they threw everything they had at the wall to see what would stick. They made two main arguments to try and force the court to accept their petition. First, the defense argued the leap year issue head-on. They told the appellate panel that the word year in everyday life is commonly interpreted as a standard anniversary cycle. They argued that a leap year should not penalize a young defendant facing a life sentence for what essentially amounts to a clerical administrative error by her attorneys. They pleaded with the court saying, look, we aimed for the anniversary date. Punishing us because February happened to have an extra day this year is a hyper-technicality that denies basic justice. But they knew that argument was legally weak on its own, so they brought in a second, much more creative legal theory. They attempted to argue that the 365-day clock should never have started on October 23rd, 2023 in the first place. Instead, they claimed it should have started on a much later date, December 15th, 2023. Why December 15th? Well, that was the specific day that transcripts from Shirilla's juvenile bind-over hearing were filed with the court. Remember, because Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old at the time of the fatal crash, her case originally started in the juvenile court system before being officially bound over to the adult court. Her lawyers argued to the appellate judges that a trial transcript isn't fully complete until all the related hearings, including those early juvenile ones, are filed and docketed. If the court bought this creative argument, their October 2024 filing would have been well within the legal time limit. But the prosecution completely contended that this was just a desperate attempt to move the goalposts after the fact. The state aggressively pushed back against the defense's narrative. They argued that juvenile probable cause hearings do not determine guilt or innocence. They are simply preliminary administrative steps to decide which court gets to actually try the case. Because a bind-over hearing doesn't decide if someone is guilty of murder, it simply does not satisfy the strict statutory definition of a trial transcript. The state made it clear that the clock starts when the transcripts of the actual adult criminal trial, the one that resulted in the murder conviction and the life sentence, are filed. The state further argued the math itself. They pointed out to the judges that the Ohio legislature deliberately chose to use the exact number 365 instead of the generic phrase 1 year when writing the post-conviction statute. They argued this specific wording removed all ambiguity regarding the timeline. It specifically overrides any assumed anniversary dates or informal calendar counting. If the law says you have 365 days, it means exactly 365 days, counting forward from the trigger date. And the 8th District Court of Appeals agreed entirely with the state's position. The justices ruled that the post-conviction relief statute strictly counts days, not calendar years. In their March 12, 2026 ruling, Judge Laster Mays and the panel explicitly stated that the trial court was absolutely correct in determining it lacked subject matter jurisdiction to hear the case. The court flat out refused to create an arbitrary leap year exception just to salvage a defense team's mathematical error. The petition was officially and firmly declared time-barred. I want to pause here for a second because this is where the cold reality of the legal system can feel incredibly harsh, even shocking, to an outsider looking in. You have a defense team claiming that they hold unexamined medical evidence about POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which they say could prove Shirilla experienced an involuntary medical blackout and didn't intentionally crash that car into the building. Whether you personally believe that medical theory or not, the fact is the appellate court never even got to look at it. The 8th District didn't say the medical evidence was fake. They didn't say the blackout theory was a lie. They didn't rule on the merits of the POTS diagnosis at all. They simply said, we do not have the legal jurisdiction to care. That is a really tough pill to swallow, regardless of which side you are on. For the families of Dominic and Davion, this ruling was likely a massive sigh of relief. It meant the murder conviction held firm, and the attempt to reopen the traumatic case was shut down on rock-solid procedural grounds. The system protected their finality, but for the defense team, it was an absolute disaster. A single day, a single miscounted 24-hour block, effectively burned down their best chance at challenging the verdict at the appellate level. We often talk about the scales of justice in true crime. We talk about weighing the evidence, balancing the facts, and finding the truth. But we rarely talk about the stopwatch of justice. The court's ruling in this appeal highlighted a brutal truth. In criminal law, it does not matter how compelling your new evidence might be if you cannot get it through the courthouse door on time. The door locks automatically. The clerk's date stamp is just as final and just as powerful as a judge's gavel. When the 8th District handed down that March 2026 ruling, the defense had to face the stark reality of what their clerical mistake had cost their client. They couldn't just apologize and refile the paperwork. They couldn't just ask the judge for a do-over because it was an honest mistake. The petition was completely irreparably dead at the district level. The court said, as plainly as legally possible, that a 365-day deadline means 365 days, leap year or not. The law simply does not bend for human error. So where does a defense team go when the appellate court flat out rejects them on a jurisdictional technicality? When the door is slammed completely in their face over a 24-hour math mistake, they have only one legal option left. They have to take it up the chain to the highest court in the state. They have to change the argument from a calendar debate to a debate about constitutional rights. And that is exactly how this simple calendar mistake morphed into a massive constitutional battle before the Ohio Supreme Court. Appeals Court upholds denial of Mackenzie Shirilla's bid for new trial. Please open your app to see this link. This news report breaks down the 8th District Court of Appeals decision to uphold the denial of Mackenzie Shirilla's petition due to the strict 365-day deadline. So, after that complete dismissal by the 8th District, we are left looking at a shattered defense strategy. The petition was basically dead in the water. But, in the legal world, when one door gets slammed in your face, you try your hardest to find a window. And that is exactly what happened next. Following the complete dismissal of the petition by the 8th District, Shirilla's case transitioned to a brand new appellate legal team. The old team, the ones who missed the leap year math, were out. These new lawyers looked at the mess left behind, they looked at the calendar mistake, and they realized they needed a massive legal pivot to save this case. On April 27, 2026, these new attorneys filed an emergency memorandum in support of jurisdiction to the Ohio Supreme Court. Wow. They took it straight to the top court in the state. But they didn't just walk in and ask the justices to politely forgive a simple clerical error. They couldn't do that because the lower court already proved that the math is absolute. Instead, they shifted the entire focus from a simple calendar mistake to a full-blown constitutional crisis. The defense argued that missing a final filing deadline due to a calendar miscalculation constitutes an undeniable instance of ineffective assistance of counsel. I see this argument pop up in complex appeals sometimes, and it is a fascinating legal maneuver. It is basically a defendant's way of telling the highest court my constitutional rights to a fair legal process were violated not by the judge, not by the police, but by the sheer incompetence of my own lawyers, right? They are throwing the previous legal team right under the bus. And frankly, they have to. They assert that a defendant facing a life sentence should not have her ultimate chance at a review erased simply by her previous lawyer's failure to account for a leap year. If you hire a professional legal team to handle your murder appeal, you expect them to know how many days are in the current calendar year, right? It sounds like such a basic thing, but that failure is the entire foundation of their new constitutional argument to the Supreme Court. But the new legal team isn't just complaining about the missed date. They claim the rejected petition actually contains crucial unexamined medical evidence, specifically extensive medical records regarding POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Now, this is where the story shifts from courtroom procedures back to the actual morning of the crash. The defense team hypothesizes that this specific condition could prove Shirilla suffered an involuntary medical blackout just moments prior to the crash. By introducing this POTS diagnosis, they are arguing she lacked the necessary conscious intent for a murder conviction. They are essentially telling the Supreme Court she didn't mean to do it. She was completely unconscious behind the wheel. And if her first set of appellate lawyers hadn't messed up the 365-day math, the lower court would have seen all of this medical proof. But the state is absolutely not backing down, not even an inch. And honestly, we have to pause here and remember the victims. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan lost their lives in a horrific, violent way. Their families are forced to watch all of this unfold in the news over and over again, hoping the justice system holds the line. Imagine being a grieving mother or father, thinking the trial gave you finality, only to hear the defense is trying to use a leap year calendar argument to introduce a medical excuse years later. The emotional whiplash for those families must be completely unbearable. Because of this, the state's response is incredibly firm. The prosecution contended that the law must be applied uniformly to every single citizen, and that carving out special exceptions undermines the structural finality of the entire justice system. They are telling the Supreme Court justices that if you bend the jurisdictional rules for a high-profile case, just because the defense made a sloppy mistake, you break the rules for everyone else. The court would be flooded with late filings from every prison in the state, all demanding the same special treatment. Furthermore, prosecutors assert the procedural deadline debate actually changes nothing about the core physical facts of the crime. And those physical facts are chilling. The state does not care about the POTS theory because they have the machine's data. During the initial trial, vehicle telemetry data showed the Toyota Camry reached an incredible 100 miles per hour with the accelerator pedal depressed to 100%. The data also showed the steering wheel was deliberately controlled until the exact violent moment of impact. As stated in the police incident report, investigators found zero evidence of braking or evasive maneuvering prior to the vehicle striking the brick building. The police said the tires never locked up in an attempt to stop. The court said the black box data proved a clear, conscious intent to crash. This digital evidence directly challenges the defense's blackout theory. Prosecutors argue very simply that an unconscious, blacked out person does not floor the gas pedal to exactly 100% and carefully steer a car down a street directly into a building without ever letting their foot slip off the gas or hit the brakes. I see why the prosecution leans so heavily on this. The black box data inside a car is devoid of emotion. It doesn't care about medical theories or legal arguments. It just permanently records exactly what the human being operating the machine was telling it to do in those final seconds. So, where does that leave us right now? As of today, June 16th, 2026, the case sits in a tense state of legal standstill. The Ohio Supreme Court operates on what is called discretionary review. That means the justices actually get to choose which cases they want to hear, and they reject the vast majority of the petitions that cross their desks. They are not forced to take this case. Right now, they are currently reviewing the submitted briefs in their chambers to determine if this leap year timeline issue truly presents a substantial constitutional question that requires their intervention. It is so important to understand the actual stakes at this exact moment. If the Supreme Court accepts the case, they will not evaluate her guilt or innocence. They are not going to look at the car crash, and they are not going to decide if she actually had a blackout. They will solely rule on whether the lower court must accept the day-late filing. They are just ruling on the math. But if the Supreme Court rejects the case, if they look at the briefs and decide that a missed deadline is just a missed deadline, the calendar mistake becomes the definitive absolute end of her state appeals. That one single leap year error will lock Shirilla into her current sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women until her very first parole eligibility in the year 2037. One day on a calendar could seal her fate for the next decade. It is a fascinating and tragic collision of human error and strict legal boundaries. It really forces us to look at how we view the system. And That brings us to the core debates that legal experts and true crime watchers are having right now. I want you to really think about these questions and let me know where you stand, based only on the facts of how the law operates. Question 1, the jurisdictional debate. Under Ohio law, statutory deadlines for post-conviction relief are absolute boundaries that strip a court of its jurisdiction if missed by even 24 hours. Do you believe appellate courts should maintain this rigid mathematical strictness to ensure finality for victims' families, or should the law allow for human error when a defense team miscalculates a leap year? Question 2, the ineffective assistance standard. The defense is currently arguing to the Ohio Supreme Court that missing a filing deadline due to a calendar miscalculation constitutes a clear violation of the defendant's constitutional right to effective counsel. From a legal standpoint, should an attorney's administrative error override the procedural rules of the court system? Question 3. Procedural rules versus new evidence. The 8th District Court of Appeals dismissed this petition strictly on its filing date without ever reviewing the newly submitted medical arguments regarding POTS. In your opinion, should a court have the discretionary power to look past a late filing if the petition contains unexamined medical data, or must procedural rules apply uniformly to every case regardless of the contents? If you want to dig deeper into the exact documents filed in this standstill, there is a great resource to check out. The Ohio Supreme Court petition over missed appeal deadline is public. This news report provides further context on the defense team's recent emergency filing to the state's highest court following the deadline miscalculation. Thank you for staying till the end to uncover the truth with us. Please subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases for more real case updates today.